Please like and subscribe if you think this baby is beautiful. The sun had barely risen over the red earth of UCHE town when Abigail stepped into the busy market square. A large wooden tray balanced perfectly on her head, stacked high with fresh tilapia and catfish she had caught with her father the night before. The air smelled of roasted plantain, palm oil, and the salty tang of her fish, mingling with the lively calls of traders bargaining at the top of their voices. Children darted between stalls, women haggled over prices, and men gathered under the shade of a large udala tree to discuss village politics. Abigail moved gracefully between the crowd, the fish swaying slightly with her steps but never falling. Years of practice had made her balance flawless. She stopped at her usual spot, a wooden bench near the well, calling out to potential buyers in a warm, persuasive tone. Her smile was quick and genuine, the kind that made people trust her. She didn't know it yet, but today would be different. Today, among the hundred of market faces, someone's eyes would linger longer than most, and her life would never be the same. Far from the palace, King Michael walked unnoticed in a faded brown wrapper and plain sandals, a cloth bag slung over his shoulder. He had disguised himself to feel the heartbeat of his people without the stiffness of royal protocols. The market noise was music to his ears, but when he spotted Abigail, something made him slow down. She was unlike anyone he had seen, confident yet gentle, her laughter carrying over the din of voices. He bought a fish from her, their hands touching briefly. Neither knew then that a single moment in the market could ripple across years, pulling them into a love story as sweet as palm wine and as dangerous as palace politics. The market was still alive with chatter as Abigail wrapped the fresh tilapia in banana leaves and handed it to the tall stranger before her. He had kind eyes, the sort that seemed to study a person beyond their words, and his smile carried a warmth that caught her off guard. "How much?" he asked in a calm voice, the deep timbre making her pause before replying. She named her price, and without bargaining, a rare thing in the market, he paid in full, adding a little extra. Abigail blinked in surprise. Customers rarely gave more than asked, but she accepted with a polite nod. "I'm Michael," he said simply. "Abigail," she replied, adjusting the tray on her head. She wondered why his hands looked uncalloused, nothing like the hands of a farmer or fisherman. He thanked her and moved away, but as she served other customers, she noticed him still nearby, pretending to browse other stalls. Something about him didn't fit the image of an ordinary traveler. His bearing was too straight, his eyes too observant. By the end of the day, Michael had returned, buying 2 more fish and asking questions about the market, about the town, about her life. Abigail answered cautiously at first but soon found herself smiling at his curiosity. She didn't know this man's story, but there was a gentle energy about him that made her feel at ease. That night, as she walked home along the dusty path with the empty tray on her head, her mind kept replaying the stranger's smile. She didn't know that, behind palace walls, servants whispered about the king's mysterious disappearance that morning. In the dark of the evening, King Michael sat alone in his royal chamber, the taste of Abigail's laughter lingering in his thoughts, more intoxicating than any palm wine. The next morning, the palace was restless. Courtiers and attendants murmured in corners, their voices low but filled with speculation. "Where does His Majesty disappear to?" one servant asked another as they polished the brass railings. The Queen, Elizabeth, sat on a carved ivory chair, her fingers drumming against the armrest. Her face was calm, but her mind boiled. She had noticed Michael's recent absences and the faint smile that lingered on his face when he returned. A smile that wasn't meant for her. When King Michael appeared, dressed in his royal robes, he offered no explanation for his outings. "I walk among my people to know their hearts," he said when the elders questioned him during morning council. But Elizabeth wasn't convinced. She knew the look of a man hiding something. Determined to find out, she instructed one of her trusted guards, Daniel, to follow the king discreetly the next time he left the palace. Meanwhile, in the heart of the bustling market, Abigail prepared her tray for the day's sales. She polished the fish with a damp cloth to keep them glistening, sprinkled fresh pepper on some, and tied her hair in a neat scarf. The memory of the stranger's kind eyes still lingered. She told herself it was nothing, yet a part of her hope to see him again. By mid-morning, as she was calling out to customers, she saw him, Michael, walking toward her with the same plain sandals and one wrapper. She smiled without realizing it. He greeted her warmly and offered to help her carry the heavy tray for a while, much to the surprise of other traders who whispered and giggled. Abigail laughed off their teasing, unaware that in the shadows of the market, Daniel was watching closely, memorizing every detail to report back to the queen. That evening, the palace corridors echoed with Daniel's footsteps as he entered the queen's private chambers. Elizabeth dismissed her maids, leaning forward with a sharp glint in her eyes. "Speak," she commanded. Daniel recounted everything, the plain clothes, the fish stall, the way the king had carried the market girl's tray as though she were a queen herself. He even described the way Michael's face softened when he looked at her. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the gold bangle on her wrist. A fish seller. Of all the women in the kingdom, her husband had chosen to spend his time with a common market girl. She masked her anger behind a thin smile. "Thank you, Daniel. You have served well," she said, dismissing him. But as soon as he left, she rose and paced the floor. This Abigail, whoever she was, had to be dealt with before she became a threat to the throne. The next day, Michael returned to the market again. He bought fish from Abigail and sat under a mango tree with her, sharing roasted yam he had purchased nearby. They talked about little things, the sound of the river at night, her late mother's recipe for fish stew, the colors of the New Yam festival. Abigail felt an ease with him she had never felt before, yet she still knew so little about him. Far away, in the palace, Elizabeth had already begun to weave her plan. She sent word to a trader in the market, a woman known for gossip, that a rich reward awaited if she could learn everything about the fish seller. The queen's mind was set. If Abigail would not step away from Michael on her own, she would be forced to. And Elizabeth had more than one way to make that happen. The sun was high, and the market was at its noisiest when Madame Clara, the queen's informant, arrived. She was a plump, talkative woman whose voice could travel farther than the town crier's drum. Balancing a basket of vegetables on her head, she wandered through the stalls, stopping often to greet traders and share the latest gossip. Today, her mission was clear: learn everything there was to know about Abigail. Clara approached Abigail's stall with a friendly smile. "Oh, Abigail, your fish are always the freshest," she said, picking one up and pretending to inspect it. "Tell me, who's that tall stranger I keep seeing with you? He looks like someone from the city, or maybe someone important." Abigail laughed lightly, brushing off the comment. "Just a customer, Madame Clara," she replied, though she couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. By the end of the day, Clara had gathered enough tidbits to carry back to the queen. Abigail's father was a fisherman, her mother had died years ago, she had never been married, and she was well liked in the market. But most importantly, she had grown close to a mysterious man whose name was Michael. Back in the palace, Elizabeth listened carefully. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. She began crafting a tale in her mind, one that would paint Abigail not as a sweet fish seller, but as a danger to the kingdom itself. All she needed was the right moment to let that story loose. Meanwhile, Abigail walked home from the market, humming softly. The New Yam festival was only days away, and she was already thinking of how beautiful the town square would look. She had no idea that while she dreamed of celebration, someone else was preparing a trap that could ruin her life. The morning of the New Yam festival burst into life with the sound of talking drums echoing across UCHE. Women wrapped in bright wrappers carried baskets of roasted yam, palm wine, and kola nuts to the town square. Children chased each other with squeals of excitement, their faces smeared with charcoal designs. Everywhere smelled of wood smoke and the sweet, earthy scent of freshly harvested yams. Abigail woke before dawn, her tray already stacked with smoked fish glistening in the early light. She tied a red scarf around her head and stepped into the busy street, moving with the current of people heading toward the square. This was the biggest market day of the year, and she intended to sell every fish before nightfall. Near the palace gates, King Michael dressed once again in his plain wrapper, slipping away without his attendants. His heart was light with anticipation, though he knew his absences were stirring whispers. Today, however, he didn't care. He wanted to spend the festival among his people, especially with Abigail. When he found her stall, she greeted him with a smile brighter than the morning sun. They shared roasted yam dipped in palm oil, laughing as they watched the masquerade troupe dance by. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. But not everyone was smiling. From the edge of the crowd, Madame Clara's sharp eyes spotted them. She wasn't alone. Daniel, the queen's guard, stood beside her, watching closely. "It's him," Clara whispered. "That's the king in disguise." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew the queen would want to hear every detail, and what he had just seen could ignite the fire she'd been waiting to light. As the drums beat louder, the first seeds of scandal began to take root, hidden beneath the joy of the festival. By evening, the palace courtyard was lit with lanterns and alive with the hum of celebration. Elders feasted at long wooden tables while dancers toured in the open space. The king had returned quietly before nightfall, changing into his royal regalia to take his place beside Queen Elizabeth. To the crowd, all appeared perfect between them, but beneath her calm smile, the queen's mind was already at work. After a sip of palm wine, she leaned toward one of the senior elders, Chief Patrick, her voice soft and deliberate. "I have heard troubling whispers," she began, making sure her tone sounded reluctant, as if sharing a burden she did not wish to carry. "A certain fish seller in the market, they say she carries a curse. That those who eat her fish fall ill after 3 days." Chief Patrick frowned. "Who is this woman?" he asked. Elizabeth sighed heavily, feigning hesitation. "Her name is Abigail. I would not speak of it if it were not dangerous to the people. And I hear she has been seen with a man who looks suspiciously like our king." By the next morning, the rumor was already spreading through the market like wildfire. Traders whispered behind their hands, some glancing nervously at Abigail's store. A few customers avoided her altogether, claiming they would rather be safe. Abigail noticed the sudden change but tried to push it aside, focusing on her work. Far away in the palace, Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the courtyard below. Her lips curled into a small smile. She knew that once suspicion took hold, it would be difficult to erase. This was only her first move, and she was prepared to make the next one far more dangerous. The next few days were unlike any Abigail had ever known. Where there had once been laughter and friendly greetings, now there were hesitant nods and suspicious glances. Mothers pulled their children away from her store. Old customers crossed to the other side of the path, pretending not to notice her calls. Even Madame Clara, who had always been overly friendly, barely stopped by, except to ask strange questions about where Abigail's fish came from. At first, Abigail thought it was simply a slow week. But the whispers grew louder. She overheard two women at the well speaking in hushed voices. "They say her fish makes people sick. I heard she was seen with a strange man. Maybe he's the reason." Her hands trembled as she washed her fish that morning, the cold water biting at her skin. She had done nothing wrong. Why would anyone say such things? Still, the fear in the air was contagious, and it began to gnaw at her confidence. That evening, as she packed her unsold fish, she saw Michael waiting by the corner of the market. His smile eased the tightness in her chest, but when he asked why she looked troubled, she brushed it off. "It's nothing. Just a quiet market day," she lied. In the shadows near the blacksmith store, Daniel watched them. He had heard enough of the rumors to know the queen's plan was taking root. All he had to do was carry the updates back to her, and she would know when to make her final, crushing move. Abigail walked home under the fading orange sky, her tray lighter than usual but her heart heavier. She didn't know it yet, but the storm had only just begun. Michael sat in his private chamber late into the night, the soft flicker of an oil lamp casting shadows across the carved walls. He replayed Abigail's face in his mind, her smile thinner than before, her eyes carrying a weight she didn't speak of. Something was wrong, and he could feel it deep in his chest. The next morning, instead of sending for his counsel immediately, he dressed again in his plain clothes and slipped out through the smaller palace gate. When he arrived at the market, he found Abigail arranging her fish with slow, almost mechanical movements. The usual cheerful greeting was missing. "Abigail," he said softly, stepping closer, "you've been troubled for days. Tell me what's going on." She shook her head, keeping her eyes on the fish. "It's nothing serious." But her voice cracked slightly, betraying her. After a long pause, she finally admitted, "People have been avoiding me. They say my fish makes people sick." Michael's brows knit together in anger. That's nonsense. Who started this? I don't know, she whispered, her voice small. I've never had such a problem before. Michael's protective instinct surged. He knew rumors in a small town could be deadly, not only for a person's business but for their safety. Abigail, I will find out who's behind this, he promised, his voice firm. She gave him a small, grateful smile, though she had no idea who he truly was, or how much power he had to make such a vow real. In the shadows of the market's narrow alley, Madame Clara lingered long enough to hear Michael's words. By the time the sun set, the queen would know that the king had not only noticed the rumors, he was now personally involved in defending the girl at the center of them. Queen Elizabeth listened with narrowed eyes as Madame Clara relayed the latest news. The king had not only visited the fish seller again but had spoken openly of protecting her. To Elizabeth, this was no longer a passing curiosity, it was a threat to her place in the palace and the respect of the kingdom. That girl needs to disappear, the queen said, her voice low and cold. She summoned Daniel, the guard who had been her eyes in the market. Spread word quietly that someone fell ill after eating her fish, she ordered. Make sure the story spreads beyond the market, into the villages, the farmlands, everywhere. Daniel bowed and left, already rehearsing the whispers he would plant. By evening, the rumor had grown teeth. A farmer claimed his child had taken sick after eating fish from the market girl, and another woman swore she had seen strange charms near Abigail's store. None of it was true, but truth mattered little once fear took hold. The next day, business was worse than ever for Abigail. Not a single fish sold before noon. Even her closest customers avoided her eyes. As she packed up early, a man she didn't know stepped into her path. Be careful, girl, he said, his voice almost pitying. Some people are saying you bring bad luck to whoever talks to you too much. That night, Michael paced his room, his fist clenched. He didn't yet know who was behind the lies, but he had made a decision, he would reveal his true identity to Abigail. She needed to know who stood beside her, and with the New Yam Festival's final celebration approaching, it might be the only way to protect her. In the palace courtyard, however, Elizabeth was already making preparations of her own. Her next move would not be whispers, it would be a public blow from which Abigail might never recover. The morning after the harshest day Abigail had faced, Michael found her sitting alone near the market well, her fish still covered and untouched. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the entire town's whispers sat on them. He sat down beside her, ignoring the curious stares of the few traders nearby. Abigail, he began, his tone steady but warm, I've been keeping something from you. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted you to know me before you knew my title. She looked up, puzzled. What do you mean? Michael took a slow breath. I am not just a traveler. My name is Michael Chike, and I am the king of UMUIF. The words hung in the air between them. Abigail blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Then she laughed softly, thinking it was a joke. You? The king. I sell fish, Michael. Why would a king sit here with me? But the seriousness in his eyes made her laughter fade. It's the truth, he said quietly. I left the palace in disguise so I could walk among my people without the barrier of the crown. That's how I found you. Abigail's mind soared. A king had been buying her fish, carrying her tray, talking to her like an equal. She didn't know whether to feel flattered, frightened, or betrayed. Why tell me now? She asked at last. Because, he said, his voice firm, the lies being spread about you are not just market gossip, they are a threat to your life. And if you are to be safe, you need to know exactly who is fighting for you. Abigail stared at him, her heart caught between disbelief and an unshakable sense that her life was about to change forever. The final day of the New Yam Festival arrived with unmatched splendor. The palace square shimmered with gold and red fabrics, and the smell of roasted yam and spices stew drifted through the air. Drummers beat their talking drums in steady rhythms, and masquerades with colorful masks danced for the crowd. It was a day meant for joy, but Queen Elizabeth had something else in mind. In the days leading up to the festival's climax, she had ensured that the rumors about Abigail reached every ear. Traders whispered them to customers, farmers passed them along at the yam fields, and visiting guests carried them back to their villages. By the time the celebration began, Abigail's name was as much a part of the festival gossip as the dancing and feasting. Michael had invited Abigail to the palace for the festival's closing ceremony, promising her safety. She arrived in her cleanest dress, carrying herself with quiet dignity despite the stares. But Elizabeth was waiting. Halfway through the ceremony, the queen rose from her seat beside the king and addressed the gathering. "My people," she began, her voice smooth but commanding, "our festival celebrates purity, harvest, and the health of our community. Yet I have heard troubling reports of sickness, illness said to come from a certain seller in our market." A murmur rolled through the crowd. All eyes turned toward Abigail, who froze under their gaze. Elizabeth continued, "We must protect our people from harm. Let us hear from those who claim to have suffered." Several voices called out, repeating the lies they had been fed. Michael's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the armrest of his chair. He could see the queen's trap unfolding before him, an ambush designed to destroy Abigail's name in front of the entire kingdom. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that Michael had prepared for this moment too. The murmurs in the palace square grew louder, twisting into accusations and fearful glances. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the shame and confusion she felt. She opened her mouth to speak, but Michael was already rising to his feet. "Enough," his voice boomed, silencing the crowd. The authority in his tone was unmistakable. Even the drummer stopped mid-beat. "These are serious accusations, and yet I see no proof, only words carried by the wind." He stepped down from the dais and walked toward Abigail, the golden hem of his robe brushing the stone floor. "Do you know who this woman is?" he asked the crowd, his voice strong. "She is Abigail, a woman who earns her living with honest hands, who sells fish caught from our own waters. She has shown more courage and dignity in her work than many in this court." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but Michael continued, turning directly to the people. "You speak of sickness. Show me the sick. Bring them forward, so we may see the truth today." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one stepped forward. Those who had claimed to be victims only days ago now avoided the king's gaze. The queen's carefully woven lies trembled under the weight of silence. Michael placed a reassuring hand on Abigail's shoulder. "I will not stand by while an innocent woman is condemned without evidence," he declared. "This kingdom is built on justice, not gossip." For a moment, there was quiet. Then a few voices in the crowd murmured in agreement. Abigail's eyes stung with unshed tears, not from fear this time, but from the shock of his public defense. She had never felt so vulnerable, and yet, somehow, so protected. But in the queen's eyes, the battle had only shifted. If Michael had chosen to shield Abigail in public, then the war for the king's heart, and for the throne, was just beginning. That night, the palace was quieter than usual. The festival had ended, but the tension from the public confrontation still lingered in the air like thick smoke. Queen Elizabeth sat alone in her private chambers, the flicker of the oil lamp casting sharp shadows across her face. She replayed the scene in her mind, Michael standing before the people, defending Abigail with a passion he had never shown her. The humiliation burned in her chest. She poured herself a cup of palm wine and took a slow sip, her eyes fixed on the dancing flame. "If the people will not turn against her," she muttered, "then I must ensure she removes herself, permanently." Her thoughts turned to Madame Clara, the gossip whose words had done so much damage in the market. Summoning her with a discreet message, Elizabeth waited until the plump woman shuffled in, bowing low. "You've done well before," the queen said, her voice smooth as silk, "but now I need more than whispers. I need action." She leaned forward, lowering her tone. "There will be a small gathering at the palace gardens in 2 days. Abigail will be there. You will arrange for her to be given a gift, a jar of special oil for cooking her fish. But it will not be ordinary oil. It will carry a substance that will make those who eat her food ill for a short time. Nothing fatal, but enough to turn the king's protection into shame." Clara's eyes widened, but the promise of gold made her nod. "It will be done, Your Majesty." As Clara left to set the plan in motion, Elizabeth allowed herself a cold smile. This time, she would not rely on rumor alone. This time, she would create the proof herself, and watch Michael's precious Abigail fall from grace in front of the entire court. 2 days later, the palace gardens bloomed with bright hibiscus flowers and the rich scent of frangipani. A soft breeze carried the sound of a small flute ensemble, and trays of kola nuts, roasted plantains, and palm wine were laid out for the guests. It was meant to be a peaceful afternoon, a sign that the festival's joy still lingered. Michael had invited Abigail to join the gathering, assuring her that she was welcome in the palace despite the rumors. She arrived in a light blue dress, her hair neatly tied, and her smile shy but warm. Michael walked beside her as they entered, his presence a silent shield against any unkind glances. From a shaded corner, Madame Clara watched them closely. In her bag was the small jar the queen had given her, a jar of special oil meant to coat the fish Abigail would be asked to prepare. She waited for her moment, biding her time. It came when Michael stepped away to speak with an elder. Clara approached Abigail with a cheerful wave. "My dear, I brought you something," she said, pulling the jar from her bag. "It's from my cousin in the city, very fine cooking oil. I thought you could use it for your fish, it makes the flavor unforgettable." Abigail accepted it with a polite thank you, setting it on the table beside her. She didn't notice the quick, satisfied glance Clara threw toward the queen, who sat across the garden sipping palm wine and pretending to be deep in conversation with a court lady. Later, as the afternoon sun softened into gold, Michael returned, smiling at Abigail. "I'd love for you to prepare some of your fish for tonight's private dinner," he said. Abigail agreed without hesitation, unaware that the jar sitting beside her could turn that dinner into a disaster that would shake the entire palace. That evening, the palace dining hall glowed under the light of dozens of oil lamps. The long table was set with polished brass plates, goblets of palm wine, and fresh leaves for serving food. Michael sat at the head of the table, relaxed and smiling, clearly looking forward to the meal. Abigail, nervous but eager to please, had spent the last hour in the palace kitchen preparing her fish using the special oil Madame Clara had given her earlier. The rich aroma filled the air as the servants carried in the dishes. Michael was the first to taste it, his eyes lighting up at the familiar flavor. "Abigail," he said warmly, "this is just as I remember from the market, perfect." Others at the table began eating as well, murmuring their approval. But within minutes, the first cough came. A court lady put down her fork, pressing a hand to her stomach. Then another elder groaned, clutching his side. One by one, the guests began to complain of sharp cramps and dizziness. Panic spread quickly, voices rising as some demanded water, others staggered to their feet. Elizabeth rose dramatically, her face a picture of shock. "What is happening here?" she asked, though her voice carried a hint of triumph. Her eyes slid to Abigail, who stood frozen, her hands trembling. "Could it be," the queen said slowly, "that the fish was tainted?" All eyes turned toward Abigail. She stammered, "No. I would never," but her voice was drowned out by the chaos in the room. Michael stood quickly, calling for the palace physician, his expression a mix of concern and fury. As the sick guests were helped from the hall, Elizabeth stepped close to the king and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I warned you about her." But Michael wasn't looking at the queen. His gaze was fixed on Abigail, on the confusion, the hurt, and the fear in her eyes. Something inside him told him this was no accident. The palace physician walked through the night, tending to the sick guests. By morning, they had all recovered enough to speak, confirming Michael's suspicion. The symptoms were short-lived and mild, nothing like a serious illness. Still, the damage to Abigail's reputation was done. Servants whispered in the corridors, and some guests left the palace muttering about curses and bad omens. Michael found Abigail sitting alone in the palace courtyard, her eyes red from crying. "I swear to you, Michael," she said, her voice breaking, "I would never harm anyone. I cook the fish exactly as I always do." "I believe you," Michael replied firmly. "And I will prove it." He called for the head of the palace kitchen. "Where is the oil Abigail used?" he asked. The cook retrieved the half-empty jar from the counter. Michael studied it, then turned to a guard. "Take this to the herbalist in the village. Tell him to test it for anything unusual." As the guard left, Michael began asking questions. "Who gave you this oil?" he asked Abigail. She hesitated. Madam Clara, she said it was from her cousin in the city. Michael's eyes narrowed. Clara was no stranger, her name had been linked to the earlier market rumors. He ordered her brought to the palace immediately. When Clara arrived, she trembled under his gaze. Where did you get the oil? Michael demanded. She stammered about buying it from a trader, but her story wavered under his questioning. By the time the herbalist returned with the results, confirming the oil contained a plant extract known to cause short-term stomach illness, Michael was certain Clara hadn't acted alone. As he dismissed her to the guard's custody, one thought burned in his mind: the Queen's hand was in this. He just needed undeniable proof before making his move. Michael spent the next day in quiet observation, keeping his thoughts to himself. He knew confronting the Queen without solid evidence would only lead to more manipulation and denials. Elizabeth was too skilled at turning accusations back on her accusers. He needed her to expose herself, publicly and beyond all doubt. That night, he called his most trusted advisor, David, into his private chamber. We are going to host another dinner, Michael said. But this time, the oil for the fish will be prepared in front of everyone, and the same jar Madame Clara brought will be present. David raised an eyebrow. You want to see if the Queen takes the bait? Michael nodded. If she tries to tamper with it again, or if she tries to stop the dinner, it will force her to act. And when she does, we will be ready. Word spread quickly through the palace of the second feast. The Queen heard it while in her private garden, sipping palm wine. Her first instinct was disbelief: surely Michael wouldn't risk another public disaster so soon. But when she learned the fish would be prepared by Abigail again, her disbelief turned to a sharp, nervous anger. She summoned Clara's replacement in her circle of loyal servants and whispered instructions, just as she had before. But this time, the secret helper she thought she could trust was already working for Michael. On the evening of the feast, guards and advisors stood in strategic positions around the kitchen and dining hall. Michael greeted guests warmly, keeping his eyes on Elizabeth, whose smile seemed just a little too tight. Abigail worked in the kitchen, unaware that this entire event was a carefully laid snare. The trap was set. All it needed now was for the Queen to make her move, and Michael prayed she would. The palace kitchen was alive with the sound of sizzling oil and the rich aroma of fresh fish. Guests in the dining hall chatted, unaware that every step of the cooking process was being closely watched. Abigail, focused on her task, didn't notice that the Queen had slipped quietly toward the kitchen door. Elizabeth entered with her usual rigor grace, a small pouch hidden in the folds of her robe. She approached the cooking table where the jar of oil sat, half full. The servant loyal to Michael greeted her politely, then stepped aside as if to give her space. Elizabeth's eyes darted to make sure no one was watching, unaware that two guards were hidden just beyond the doorway. She opened the pouch and tipped a pinch of powder into the oil, stirring it quickly before replacing the lid. Her movements were swift and practiced, the work of someone who had done this before. Your Majesty, came Michael's voice suddenly from behind her. Elizabeth froze, her hand still near the jar. She turned slowly, forcing a smile. I was only checking the kitchen, she said smoothly. Michael stepped forward, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. Interesting, because the kitchen already has its own overseer tonight. And because I asked my guards to watch this jar closely. He signaled to the guards, who stepped into the room. One picked up the jar and handed it to the palace herbalist waiting nearby. Within minutes, the herbalist confirmed in front of the assembled guests that the oil had been tampered with. Gasps filled the air as Michael turned to face the Queen. So tell us, Elizabeth, he said, his voice carrying through the hall, what curse were you truly trying to place on this kingdom? Elizabeth's mask of composure cracked for the first time. She opened her mouth to speak, but the murmurs of the crowd drowned out her words. The trap had worked, her betrayal was no longer rumor, but undeniable truth. The palace courtyard was filled with people the next morning. Word of the Queen's public exposure had spread far beyond the palace walls, drawing villagers, traders, and elders to witness what would happen. Michael stood on the palace steps, his voice carrying over the crowd. Last night, he began, we discovered that the illness during our festival dinner was not caused by Abigail's food, but by poison deliberately placed in her cooking oil. That poison was added by none other than Queen Elizabeth. Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd. Abigail stood beside Michael, her head slightly bowed, but the relief in her eyes was clear. For the first time in weeks, she felt the heavy weight of suspicion lifting from her shoulders. Elizabeth was brought forward, her face pale but her posture still proud. Michael looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. You have betrayed this kingdom, shamed the crown, and sought to destroy an innocent woman out of jealousy. For this, you will no longer be queen. He removed the beaded crown from her head and handed it to one of the elders. Guards escorted her away as the crowd murmured, some in shock, others in satisfaction. Turning to the people, Michael took Abigail's hand. Let this be a lesson to us all, that lies can destroy, but truth will always rise. The crowd erupted in cheers, some calling Abigail's name. Later, in the quiet of the palace garden, Michael spoke softly to her. You were wrong, but you stood with dignity. If you will have me, I would like you not just by my side as a friend, but as my queen. Tears filled Abigail's eyes. She nodded, and in that moment, the pain of the past was replaced by hope for the future, a future built on love, truth, and trust.